unpacking today's headlines. This is Souls and Liberty in Depth.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to In Depth, a production of Souls and Liberty brought to you in partnership with MyPillow.com. Canada has been in the news a lot lately since Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made an emergency trip south to Mar-a-Lago about 6 weeks ago to beg President-elect Trump not to enact tariffs on his country. Our neighbor to the north and the dysfunction that it's currently suffering has come under increasing scrutiny here in the United States. Now, much of this, of course, has been spurred by Trump's incessant trolling of Trudeau and his followers and colleagues. Reports came out that Trump basically said that if Canada can't pay its own way, so to speak, then it should become the 51st state, and Trudeau perhaps its governor. We see an example of the continued trolling here. Trump issued this meme in December. We see him looking wistfully, perhaps hungrily, at the Canadian wilderness, him saying, "Oh, Canada," a reference to the Canadian national anthem there. Now, looking beyond the annexation bluster, the 51st state trolling, Americans should know what's going on in our neighbor to the north, as Canada's plight will be America's plight if Trump is not successful in uprooting the deep state in our own country. The Marxists, the deep state agents, they're not just focusing on the United States. They are focusing on every single country across the West. They've made tremendous inroads here in Canada, in the UK, as we see, everywhere, basically across the West. And so this really is a shared common threat that we're facing. Here to discuss all of this with us today is Souls and Liberty contributor and Canadian conservative Arthur Clareau. I'm your host, Stephen Wynn, coming to you from Kansas City. Arthur, welcome. First of all, you're joining us from Toronto, and we want to hear your perspective on all of this today because it's a fascinating story. What's going on up there in Canada? I don't think most Americans grasp how badly Canada is suffering today, and so I'd like to get your perspective. Share with our viewers what your country is enduring and how bad things have become and how quickly they have gone sour, basically, over the course of the 9 years that Trudeau has been in office.
Hey, Stephen. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me on again. It's always great to be able to have these conversations. And this is one that doesn't come up all that often, although I think with social media, we hear snippets here and there of how bad things are. It's like how we hear, bad things are going on in Sweden and in Germany and
Right.
all over the West. And I think by now, a lot of us have pieced together that this is not random. This is part of a larger orchestrated project that's been going on for decades and is just now starting to really manifest. But one of the reasons why I think in Canada particularly, it stands out so much and it's so obvious is because Canada is a very small country. Like New Zealand, like some of these other Anglosphere nations, it only has a small population. Prior to opening the floodgates to immigration a few decades ago, it had a population, I think, under 20 million. So it's a very small country, and therefore all of these effects show more quickly, right? The same thing has been happening in the United States as is happening here, but to infiltrate 300 million is different than infiltrating what is, let's say 30 million here.
Right.
That being said, yeah, it's pretty much a disaster. In so many ways, it's hard to know where to begin. Whether you want to go back to the very beginning and where it all started, whether you want to start where we are now and work backwards, I'm not sure which way you'd rather go, but
Sure. Let's start where things are now, and then we can kind of retrace how we got here. From my own personal perspective, I follow things internationally, but until a couple of months ago, I had no idea how bad things were up in Canada. But suddenly I started reading reports about the stagnant wage levels there, the fact that your richest province, Ontario, is now on a per capita basis basically equivalent to Alabama, one of our poorest states. Canada had always, up until Trudeau came to power, largely shadowed the U.S. in terms of GDP growth, per capita income growth, and whatnot. And so to read that, I was just stunned. I thought, what is going on up there? And then reports surfacing that millions of Canadians are relying on food banks just to get by month to month. That just blew my mind. So yeah, let's paint a picture of the condition of of Canadian society as it is today. I mean, our viewers will understand, they know how bad things have been here in the US after just 4 years of Biden rule. Well, you guys have had 9 years of that same kind of leftist insanity in power in Ottawa. So tell us, share with us what the effects of that have been.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, to start with, the economic position is exactly as you described. Imagine the taxes and the housing prices and the cost of living of California. And that's about what it is in Canada, no matter where you go. So whether you're in a big city or you're in a rural town or you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's the same price. It's the same everything. But the income, like you said, of Alabama, for most people's wages have declined since the 1970s, while production has skyrocketed, GDP has skyrocketed. Really, what it comes down to with the economics of Canada is it's almost as if Canada's been running this giant Ponzi scheme for a little while. Rather than really develop economically, what it's done instead is take the easy way and print money while importing just enough people through mass immigration to make sure that there was some nominal GDP movement, even though a lot of that was kind of a circular motion. It was like we print money to give to the people we brought in, who then spend it, which shows GDP growth, which allows us to print more money, but then we have to keep bringing people in. And you kind of see where that's going. So Canada's been doing that for decades, but even before Trudeau, but Trudeau definitely greatly increased that amount to the point where if you go back to 10 years ago, it wasn't nearly as bad. People were able to afford homes. But especially once COVID hit, and that's a whole other topic there, but once COVID hit, and the measures that Trudeau and his government took during the COVID situation exacerbated this so much. I think it was that what they printed, like in the United States, was something like 80% of the currency that had ever been in circulation during that year. So they felt they had to bring in even more people to continue this circle that was going on, this economic cycle. And so they flooded in, I think it was something like 5 or 6 million people into a country of, at the time, 34 or 35 million.
Okay, let me just stop you there because I want our viewers to understand that. Okay, you said about 5 million people?
About that, yeah.
Okay, so again, for American viewers, multiply this by 10, basically. We have been recoiling at the horror of 8 to 12 plus million immigrants coming in illegally. Imagine 50 million, because that's what it would be, akin to, basically, immigrants being admitted legally into the United States in just the past decade. That is unsustainable. A country cannot accommodate that and without destabilizing. And that's exactly what's happening to your country. Okay, go ahead, Arthur. I just wanted to throw that point out there.
No, that's a great point. And that's exactly what it would be. It'd be the equivalent of 50 to 60 million newcomers going into the nation. Now, in Canada, unlike in the United States, there are only about 6 to 8 major cities. So almost all of those people go to those cities. And you have to remember, too, almost all of those people are also on some form of government subsidy or another. The government is subsidizing the entire mass immigration project heavily. So that, of course, again, just continues to contribute to inflation, to the tax burden, to all these different problems. So it's like they're digging themselves deeper in the hole faster and faster and faster. The government of Canada is, and the scary part about it is that most Canadians feel like they have no say in this. They're waiting with bated breath now because we have an election coming up. It could be in March, could be in November. We're not quite sure, and we can get into detail on that later. But and we're hoping that the new guy coming in, who will most likely be a conservative, is going to address this. And he's given us, he's given some. He's at least spoken on the topic. We can never know until it actually happens, but he's at least addressed it. But at the same time, I think a lot of Americans are also feeling this. There's this kind of concern for a lot of people that even with the election cycles, even with the ability to elect a new leader, how much say do we really have in what's going on in our countries? And it sounds like for a while in the past, I guess I would have said, well, how much does that really matter? How much does it really bother you? You have your own little life. Just do what you can where you are. And to some degree, I still agree with that. But eventually, politics finds you, whether you like it or not, whether you follow it or not. Politics affects you, as Canadians are recognizing now, right? You can't afford a home. One of the issues with having that many people come in as well is that the government subsidizes hiring them over hiring Canadian citizens. So every major corporation, every job that, from the ones that would have been for for teenagers coming out of high school or college students, to the ones that are middle management or upper management, even are bringing in and hiring newcomers as opposed to people who are already here, simply for that reason. Hey, it's cheaper. Why wouldn't you? The government pays for it. So that's another issue too. So it's like you're getting hit with the 1-2. You can't really find a job. You also can't afford to get a house. You also have to pay high taxes. So there's all these things hitting you. So for the average Canadian, it's a very, very tough place to be right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've seen online Canadians, just complaining about the fact that, yeah, as you say, it's not just high level corporate jobs that they're being frozen out of. I've seen Canadian parents complaining that their teenage son or daughter, they can't even get a job at Tim Hortons or McDonald's or Subway. Just basic entry level positions at a fast food restaurant because they're literally being frozen out. It's immigrants, it's the newcomers that are being given preferential treatment.
Yes.
So how do you establish a life? How do you begin to build a life? With that, every single door being slammed in your face, and yeah, it's really, really interesting just to see the reaction of so many Canadians online. There's I can, and you can speak to this, but I just sense a growing frustration at the futility of everything. I mean, you work hard, you plan, you save, you try to get ahead, put away some savings for a rainy day, so to speak. But all of that is gone. All of it is for naught under this current system. So you're just literally waking up in the morning, going, suffering drudgery for just to put food on the table, and in many cases, that's not even enough for that. You've got to go to your neighborhood food bank basically to help get you through. It's just, and something else I've noticed is online is you're hearing stuff now that as an American I would never have heard coming from Canadians a decade ago. With all the Trump trolling about annexation and all of that. There's a lot of people, a lot of Canadians on there who are actually entertaining that idea, and that would have been unheard of a decade ago. But things are so bad there now. People see there's such hopelessness. There's no prospect of a future. Some are thinking, well, let's just dissolve the nation and try to connect with the United States, which itself is that would be quite a gamble because we are certainly not out of the woods yet. We've got a long, long, long way to go before Trump's reforms take root. Please God, let that happen. But yeah, it's just really interesting seeing. I would call it a level of despair that I've not seen before coming out of Canada. Would you say that's true?
I would think so. Yeah, if you had asked, I mean, even now, as Trump was trolling, there was a little bit of bluster from some of the more patriotic Canadians, but that's a group of people that's declining rapidly,
Right.
And it's declining for many reasons. One of the main reasons is because its government, Canada's government itself, really pushes against that. It doesn't want. It sounds so bizarre, especially I think to an American, but the Canadian government really wants to be a post-nation state.
Yes.
Therefore, it pushes against nationalism, identitarianism, any sort of traditionalism that would have been up until very recently quintessentially Canadian.
Right.
The Canadian experiment. I have my qualms with the American experiment. By the way, I do, and
Sure.
I think a lot of people on the right do. The melting pot concept, there's some merit to it, and there's definitely some downsides to it. But Canada's is not even that. Canada, rather than a melting pot, decided what they wanted to do was become a mosaic. This is their term, mosaic. So it was come from anywhere in the world, literally anywhere, and you don't need to change a thing. Stay exactly the way you are, and you're just as Canadian as anyone else, and just keep doing your thing. And then that can be managed if you have a very small minority of those people, right? You have a vast majority of kind of one culture, Canadian, Christian, whatever it is, that's the main group. And then you have a couple of little outsiders and outliers. Fine, no big deal. But with mass immigration, you end up with mass numbers of people who have zero intention of being Canadian. And in fact, in the recent influx, a huge number, by the way, for those 5 million that came in and pretty much for the 2 decades prior, so the millions of people that had come in prior to that, Canada has prioritized 2 nations. So something like 70 or 80% of all immigrants come from these 2 nations. One is China, the other is India. So oddly enough, the Chinese, they do conglomerate into a diaspora. They do kind of just work together. They don't really learn English. They do their, they create the sort of Chinatown situation. But with the Indian diaspora, and that includes Sikh and Hindu and all these other sorts of groups, there's a surging nationalism and identitarianism within Indian communities right now. In India, it's a big deal in India under Modi. And we can discuss the merits of that another time. I'm sure there's good and upsides and downsides to it. But regardless, there is a huge surge in identitarianism amongst Indians, and there's also an identitarian movement amongst Sikhs from North India. And so they have conflict there in India over these identities, and that conflict has now moved to Canada, and it's very prominent in Canada, in entire cities in Canada, because of the way this has happened. So we now have millions of people with very strong identities who have no intention of becoming Canadian and who are slowly reframing Canadian as whatever they are because their population is increasing. And like I said earlier, the patriotic Canadian with a very strong Canadian identity is decreasing intentionally. Right. So it's talk about national security threat. There's one.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's again, you go online and you see these you just see clips coming out of Canada that you just think I don't recognize this country anymore. It seems to be that much of Canadian society, Americans, we have this stereotypical vision of Canada as, extremely well ordered, good governed, very nice, polite people, maybe a little bit passive aggressive if they get riled up, something like that. But by and large, just very, good salt of the earth, a placid society. But the clips coming out of Canada now fly in the face of that. It seems that Canadian society is becoming very hostile. The members of the society to one another, very ugly. Actually, demonstrating some of the worst excesses of American society, a Marxist American society. The past few years, we've seen more than 100 churches, principally Catholic churches, have been burned to the ground all across Canada, and that really has not that problem has not been effectively addressed by the government. We've seen an explosion in anti-Semitism across the country, which just again blows my mind. Montreal, Toronto, I've read is very bad, but Montreal really is the Jew hate capital of the Western Hemisphere now. It's just incredible. We've got a graphic showing a recent headline explaining that, and then we see you mentioned India and China. I see constantly now marches, protests in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Montreal, of people who are, I mean, for all practical purposes, jihadists, pro Hamas, pro Hezbollah. They're waving, the Palestinian flag. Not a one of them is waving the Canadian flag, and it's I don't know. It's really disconcerting to see that. We've got a clip, a recent report here filed, kind of addressing some recent, for lack of a better term, jihadist violence in Montreal. Let's take a look.
Montreal erupted into chaos as pro-Palestinian and Arab activists unleashed a night of terror. Streets were vandalized, vehicles torched, and violent clashes broke out with overwhelmed police. Fires blazed across the city as radical jihadists marched through neighborhoods, shouting anti-Semitic slurs, smashing windows, and spreading terror. Despite months of escalating tensions and clear warnings, law enforcement was unable to contain the violence, raising serious questions about Montreal's ability to confront this growing threat. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was shaking it up at a Taylor Swift concert in Toronto, while Montreal experienced one of the most violent nights in the city's history. Without decisive intervention, this unrest will not only continue, but spread, threatening the safety of communities across Canada.
All right. And now, this may not be happening every day in Quebec or in Ontario, but it's certainly happening enough to be concerning, I think, to a lot of conservatives, both in Canada and here in the United States. It's the folks doing that are clearly not of the same worldview as you or I are, and it just seems to be destabilizing the entire fabric of Canadian society.
It's the end result of the postmodern liberal agenda.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only way I can put it. And some people will take issue with it, calling it liberal, but really it is. It is what it is. The idea that I wrote it. I wrote an article probably like 7 or 8 years ago now, called, and basically I was watching. I love football, soccer, European football. Yeah. So I was watching my favorite team, which is Liverpool, and they had fielded this young kind of B grade team, right? It was the B line. It was not the top players, and you could see like just the quality. I'd watched the main team, and then I watched this second game with the second team, and the quality was just nothing close. And so I wrote this article about just how obvious it shows that you can take something, a team, a country, and you can keep it the same name and the same colors and the same flag, but its quality and what it's able to accomplish is really heavily dependent on who makes it up. It's the people. Take Ford under Henry Ford or Ford when it was about to go bankrupt. It's two different, completely different things because the people running it are completely different. And I think that's one of the things that we sometimes forget when we talk about all this sort of stuff, because, when you think Canadian, when someone says anti-Semitism or, anti-Christian hate or any of these sorts of things are rising in Canada, you stop and you go like, why are the Canadians like this? Like, what happened? Who hurt you? But that's not what it is at all, right? It's not that. It's look, if you and taking again the merits of these conversations aside, like what's happening in the Middle East aside, if you take Palestinians and Israelis and put them anywhere else in the world on a piece of land, you're probably going to have a similar sort of antagonism between them. Right. Same as if you take Pakistanis and Indians, or if you take, you can name it almost anywhere. Northern and Southern Irish at one point. Right. Like there's a lot of places in the world where there are these animosities, and I think there's some merit to the idea that, okay, if you bring people like that into a already functioning society with very strong rule of law and very strong order, they can function and they can learn. Like, the I don't know if you saw the movie Don't Mess with the Zohan, This is not a recommendation necessarily, but the whole point of the movie was, hey, Palestinians and Israelis live in New York and we're all happy here. This is such a great, multiculturalism, such a wonderful thing. And again, to some degree, to a small degree, with a few people, yeah, it can work. But if those diasporas start to grow, there's been some study done now by a few researchers out of Oxford that as these diasporas grow, they not only fail to assimilate, but they begin to assimilate those around them into the diaspora. So you start to essentially just be transplanting one country and whatever happens over there, good or bad, into another country. So it's one of those things where, like, again, in balance, there are times where, hey, maybe some immigration is a good thing, and there are times where no immigration is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And there are times where, maybe relaxing a bit of the rule of law is a good thing. There's time where you really need to start clamping down on the rule of law. So I think that's the case in Canada right now, where everything we've spoken of is an issue, and we haven't even began to mix in the ingredient that really messes things up, which is DEI, the whole kind of Marxist aspect of this, the whole very anti-white aspect of this, the whole anti-Christian aspect of this, where we have the exact same problem that was happening in the United States, except for us, it was just implemented. See, at least in the United States, you have more separation of powers because it's so much broader and there's so much more of so many layers of government and layers of bureaucracy. It does take time to infiltrate all of that. Whereas in Canada, there really is the federal government, the provincial government. And I mean, you get to elect local governments, but those two can overrule your local government at a whim. Like there's just no, if you, for example, so provincial, would be the state government. If your municipality decides something and they don't like it, they can overrule it, or they can actually just completely remove everyone you just elected to your municipal government and replace them. That's the kind of power the provincial government has. One example of this is there was a town in Ontario that voted against the gay pride stuff. And so they got fined for every day that they refused it. And I can't remember all the details of it, but basically they got fined by the province for just not doing it. And that's the official framework. There's also these new, which Jordan Peterson came up against, these new inventions of the last decade or so called human rights tribunals, which essentially act as quasi courts, but given power by the government, but they are really just filled with activists and, complete nonsense people who just have a vendetta. So they're just there they're the commissars. They're the people who are there to make sure that you're communist enough, you're a good communist, and you follow the orders. And no matter who you are, they can call you in.
Right. This is just so fascinating. We've got to take a commercial break, but when we come back, I want to dive further into this. I want to look into, how did Canada get here? Where is Canada going? But as part of that, I want you to speak further on this kind of thing because you watch a 2-minute soundbite from Trudeau on Fox News or CNN or whatever, and you think, oh, what an idiot. You dive a little bit deeper and you see, oh, this guy is really, Canada is suffering because of him. Stagnant wage growth, all this. But when you peer even closer, his agenda, his colleagues. It's scary, actually. It's ominous. They are a true threat to liberty in Canada. The worst excesses of Biden-Harris that we were facing here in the United States, censorship, unjust imprisonment, all this kind of stuff. That is very uncomfortably close, I think, to many in Canada. So I'd like you to speak to all of that, a little bit more when we return. So we will continue this conversation in just a minute. Stay tuned.
Just like all of you, I had problems sleeping. I had tried every pillow out there and nothing worked. I'd flip-flop all night, use my arm for support, and fall asleep, or I'd wake up with a sore neck or maybe a headache. Well, quality sleep comes from keeping your neck straight at night. You have to fill in that space between your head and your bed. That's why I invented My Pillow. My Pillow's patented fill adjusts to your exact individual needs, and it doesn't matter if you sleep on your back, stomach, side, or any combination of all three.
When I got My Pillow, I'm asleep almost immediately. I stay asleep at night and I wake up more well-rested in the morning.
So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get Classic King My Pillows for only $19.98. Queen size just $18.98. Standard Classic My Pillows only $14.98. That's right, only $14.98. Plus all orders $75 or more ship absolutely free.
All right, everyone, welcome back. We're discussing the plight of Canada, and we want to look at now how the country got here and where it's going, basically, because again, it's a canary in the proverbial gold mine, basically, for the United States. If Trump is not successful in implementing his reforms, in uprooting the deep state, which is going to be a monumental task, we're going to be facing once again what Canada is suffering right now. The roots of Canada's demise, of course, goes back decades and decades and decades. I would say, from what I've learned, what I've read, and Arthur, you can comment on this, the roots really began to spring forth in the 1960s. No surprise, America's demise really started to accelerate here in the 60s. That same spirit was prevalent, it seems, in every country across the West. And a major figure to get that going was the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, his father, Pierre Trudeau, a self-identified Catholic from Quebec. He ruled Canada from 1968 to 1979, and then again from 1980 to 1984. And we've got a graphic of him here. Let's take a look at that as we continue to talk. He really revolutionized Canadian society in many ways, wouldn't you say, Arthur? Can you describe the effect he had on your country?
Yeah. So if you look at the United States prior to the 1960s, right, prior to the Civil Rights Act, prior to the Immigration Act, prior to the successive acts that all surrounded that and changed the entire kind of the way things were done, changed the outlook. That's essentially Trudeau for Canada. All of those things, or most of those things, I should say, were passed by Trudeau or pushed by Trudeau. He was the one first of all, he was extremely socialist, very, very cozy with communists. This, of course, is the the story. No matter where in the West you go, if you look for who is behind it, it's going to be these guys. And he set about doing everything he possibly could to change I guess sever Canada from its roots, and to create a new order in I guess the communist image, let's just say, or the one world or the new world order image, however you want to say it. So under his, if I'm not mistaken, under his time in office, Canada replaced their old flag, which was, if you look at Australia or New Zealand, it was similar to that. Right. It was a red flag with a Canadian crest and a British flag in the corner, because of course the Dominion of Canada was a British colony and then became its own country by just voting itself into its own dominionship, kind of like Australia or New Zealand, basically the Anglosphere. And Canada's culture was very British. So when you mentioned earlier that it was very orderly and people were very polite, if a little passive aggressive, that was all because it was British. That's just very much British culture.
Sure.
There was the French, yes, don't get me wrong, and Canada's bilingual because of that. And is part of the whole how Canada became a country. The French played a big role, therefore there's some influence there. But outside of Quebec and a few areas of some of the coastal provinces on the Atlantic, everyone speaks English. No one speaks French. So Canada was always just very English. And Ontario, Toronto, Ottawa, this whole area, this corridor, this was kind of like the New England of Canada. This is where the first settlers came. This is where Canadians have been the longest, and where Canadian culture kind of began. So Trudeau was one of the first people, Pierre Trudeau was one of the first to institute this idea of multiculturalism. He was the first to introduce it. The idea that, well, you know what, first of all, we should open our doors to everybody. Secondly, what does it mean to be Canadian? Well, you would say it's just British, but you know what? It's also British and French. Therefore, we're multicultural. Therefore, why not British, French, and everyone else? That's kind of the concept. And so he took steps to, like, changing the flag and changing some certain laws and instituting new kind of civil rights type laws and immigration laws, um, to just fundamentally change the makeup of the country, both in its character, its culture, and its people, with the idea that, and I think if we look at all of this, this happened around the Western world
Yeah.
exactly at the same time.
Right.
Like between 1960 and 1970, over a decade. Kind of like how we see, if we were looking back at kind of the WEF dictum, right? The Agenda 2030 stuff. Some of these things that kind of get discussed behind closed doors and then implemented across our countries simultaneously. That sort of thing's been happening for a while, obviously. And I mentioned this to you earlier, but when we hear communist influence and the communist threat and what the communists have been doing in the West, sometimes it can conjure up images of like the Russians sitting in their offices with tapping their fingers, coming up with sneaky plans to undermine and destroy us. But this isn't the Russians. I mean, I'm sure maybe they had some part in it and they did their part, but this is all internal.
Yeah.
Every single one of our countries had people who were part of this and who were helping to move this forward. And it's really interesting because there's two books I think that I would recommend on this. The first is by his last name is Jude, and I can't remember the first name unfortunately because I'm just thinking about this now. But it's called Post-War, and it's a history book that it gets into minute detail of the post-war consensus. So 1945, you have the peace treaties in Germany. And following that, how Europe is divided and what happens in each country going forward. And what you find is that the basis of the European Union, the basis of so much of our global government that we have in place today, and the basis of most political parties across Europe are all communists and socialists and are filled by communists and socialists. And while some of them had to say they were socialists so that, because of the Cold War started and there were certain issues there, they were still very much in favor of communistic, socialistic practices and were trying to implement those at home. So it's a weird thing to wrap your head around because you think of the 1950s and 60s as, besides the hippie revolution and that whole change that happened, you think of them more as a kind of like anti-communist, very staunchly Christian, pro-West time, and they were. But at the same time, many of the people who were staffing and filling high offices across Europe and Canada and Australia and all these places were the opposite. They were actually pro-communist. They were just finding ways to implement them here.
Yeah.
Another great book on this, and I won't get into too much detail on that, is Diana West's American Betrayal. Because she points out how in the United States, this was all happening around the same time. She can trace it back to the 1930s, although it precedes that. And she gets into detail how under Roosevelt and then Truman, and even under Eisenhower and other presidents who were great presidents, you had this successive march forward of these kind of communist infiltrators. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. But essentially, that kind of outlines the story of what happened across the West at that time. And of course, the exact same thing was being pushed by Trudeau here in Canada.
Right. Yeah, it's been fascinating from the perspective of an American, just reading about Canadian history over the past century or so. Today Canada it's almost been reduced to stereotypes. Maple syrup, hockey, nice, polite people. What else? Beer, perhaps. But there is so much more to Canadian history, to Canadian identity than any of us, I think, here in the United States, and probably many of you in Canada realize, because you've been severed from your history, and that's a typical Marxist ploy. Basically, they're doing it here in the U.S. as well. That's why we don't have civics education in this country anymore. It's why we're being taught revisionist history in our classrooms, if we're being taught any history at all. You've got to sever yourself from the past, basically, in order to really allow the revolution that they have devised to take root. And you see that in Canada. Speaking to this point, I want to read an excerpt. Just over the past month or so, I've been doing a lot of reading about Canada online, and I came across a fascinating newsletter, basically, from a conservative group calling itself the Canadian Intelligence Service. And they released a warning about Pierre Trudeau. They published this in March 1968, 1 month before he came to power in Ottawa. And the title of this quote is lifted from an article titled "Trudeau Spearheading Fabian Takeover." Fabian being a reference to the Fabian Socialists, a group of leftists who were very content to allow socialism, even communism, to take root, but to do so gradually. There wouldn't be any of there's this sort of over the night revolution like the Bolsheviks had done in Russia. They were very content for the slow incremental approach to achieve their aims over the course of a generation or two, and that's exactly what Pierre Trudeau was. So we got a clip here, or an excerpt that I want to read because I just find it fascinating. So they warned, this concept, meaning Trudeau's ideology, this concept demolishes the basis of Western civilization. That basis being a scriptural basis, a concept of man related and responsible to God for his life and actions, with his guide or law being not any man-made theory, but rather the commandments and exhortations of God's word. It is impossible to exaggerate the significance implicit in this shift away from the scriptural and over to the humanistic. And incredible is the failure of not only our political leaders, but also our religious leaders to speak out. To the extent that Trudeau extends his influence and is politically advanced, Canada will move toward the communists. I just find that fascinating because, again, here we have this snapshot in time, March 1968, which was a tumultuous year for every nation in the West. But we have, to me, that quote is like, it's like an epitaph signaling what Canada once was, a patriotic, conservative, Christian society, not this leftist lunacy that we hear about, that we see playing out on our screens every day. And it stands as a very sad testament to what they knew would be coming if he were to attain power. And 55 plus years later, look at Canada. That's what we have, basically. He got the ball rolling with the slow motion revolution, and in the course of a couple generations, today's Canada is unrecognizable. It would be unrecognizable to your grandfathers and grandmothers. It's truly tragic.
If those men, the ones who fought in the wars, the men who wrote this type of thing, had seen what Canada would become, I'm pretty sure they would have just instituted martial law and rounded up the communists and put them on an ice floe.
Absolutely.
Because it didn't have to be this way.
Yeah.
And it's actually really sad. I'm a big history fan, and it's really sad when there's some great tragedy to seeing civilizational decline.
Yes.
And I watched a lot of old movies from the 40s and 50s and 60s. I've watched I've read a lot of this, I understand the perspective. Let's put it this way. I understand the perspective of the people who were running the country in the early 20th century and the late 19th century. And it's like comparing Teddy Roosevelt to Kamala Harris. It's like it's not even comparable. It's like it's a joke. Right. And it's a shame because so few Canadians today are even aware of this. Like you said, they've been completely severed from the roots. High schools, I remember I moved to Toronto at the end of 2019 from out west. And I have a younger sister who had just graduated from high school at the time. And every single person from her class pretty much was a self-avowed communist.
Yeah.
And she went to a Catholic school, by the way. This wasn't public school. I mean, it's kind of like public school, but it's Catholic.
Right.
And this was not only her school. Every Canadian in these age groups, in these younger generations, is graduating as a communist, or at least so steeped in a communist ideal that you have to play the game within that worldview. You have to start the conversation from way over there rather than from, point of pragmatism or, the real point. And and this speaks to kind of a broader problem in Canada right now. This is a problem that conservatives deal with all the time. And I don't even know if many conservatives are aware that this is a problem, because they might be so steeped in it as well. I've said before, the Conservative Party in Canada for a very long time has been quasi-Democrat. It could be maybe a Bill Clinton 1990s Democrat Party, but it's still very left-leaning for a conservative party.
Right.
And so the entire conversation, the whole Overton window politically here, is very left-leaning. So it's like they did such a good job, the Trudeaus of the world, of setting this stage and reframe and just reorganizing quietly every single part of society to where the people who were being born didn't even realize that there was something before it, and now just kind of perpetuate their system. It is just fiendishly brilliant, but very sad to see. And my point here was just, I wish I could have met the kinds of people who wrote this stuff, and who, I'd love to have more people like this in Canada today.
Oh, exactly. It would turn the country around, if you had an army of such men and women. Yeah, it's interesting to the point about, they lamented that not only are our political leaders saying nothing, but our religious leaders are saying nothing as well. That's very interesting because, as a Catholic, I know that when Humane Vitae, the Pope's his reaffirmation of the Church's stance on artificial contraception, when that was released in 1968, all the bishops of Canada collectively issued the Winnipeg Statement, basically disavowing, denouncing Humane Vitae, and essentially, for all practical purposes, telling Canadian Catholics that they didn't have to abide by it. And at the same time, the faith in Quebec, which was once one of the great Catholic strongholds, in the world, it very, very quickly began to wither away, to the point where today it's just, there's barely a pulse at all left there. So it's interesting to see this infestation, this just collapse, basically becoming evident, at least in the late 60s, not only in the political sphere but in the religious as well. I specifically addressed the Catholic. I'm sure many of the Protestant denominations were equally compromised. Otherwise, there would have been a great uprising against this sort of thing. So we've looked at the father. Let's look at the son now. Basically, you fast forward to 2015. Pierre Trudeau, he leaves power for the final time in 1984. His son succeeds him. Justin Trudeau is swept to power in 2015. Basically, I don't want to, make it, simplify this too much, but from what I've read, he was swept to power basically on promises to legalize marijuana, and he was also said to have charmed much of the female electorate with his, good hair, good looks, and whatnot. So that really started the second phase of this great revolution. Would you say that is fair?
Yes. Yeah, I would.
Okay. And so I'd like to dive deeper too, a little bit into what you were saying about the DEI, also to address just the ominous sort of authoritarian trend that has seemed to be developing over the past decade. Now, first of all, not only did Trudeau legalize, he got marijuana legalized across the country, but euthanasia as well. Today, we've always heard the Netherlands was really sort of, ground zero for the euthanasia movement, first country to legalize it in 2000 or 2001, I forget which. But today, that crown basically has been shifted to Canada under the lovely soft sounding medical aid in dying program, basically euthanasia. Thousands and thousands of Canadians are euthanizing themselves, especially they can't. I've read accounts where they're being pressured to do so by the government because for cost savings, or you don't want to be a burden on your family, etc. It's grown in scope beyond what was ever intended, and so completely immoral practice there. Trudeau, you mentioned this term earlier. You described Canada as post-national. He actually declared Canada in an interview with the New York Times right after he was elected in 2015. He told the New York Times that Canada, he described it as the world's first post-national state. And from what I've read about his whole program, it's been just that. The severing of Canadian identity, the bearing of the identity, the bearing of your history that his father began, he has really been completing. And so again, to the point where some Canadians they don't know what to do. They're fit to be tied. Some want to a lot of them want to emigrate. Some want to join the U.S. Others, want to say no. Let's stick it out. Let's fight. But they're disorganized and not really sure what to do. The impact of Justin Trudeau on Canadian society has just been, I don't know. I don't know if there's a modern equivalent. I'm just amazed at the effect that he's had and how quickly all of this has come about. Anyway, I'd like you to just kind of speak on that, and feel free to talk about the DEI aspect, the lapse toward totalitarianism, etc. Whatever you want to talk about there.
Sure, yeah. Well, look, you're absolutely right. He has decimated Canada. And of course, like all of these leaders, and they always say these sorts of things, he pretends as if this is somehow a wonderful thing. It's a point of pride for him. He believes, he probably believes it's a point, it's a wonderful thing. Canada's an interesting story because since its inception, it's had an authoritarian streak. People don't think about that because we're the polite, nice people up north. Mm-hmm. But Canada, from the very beginning, I won't do a Putin here and go all the way back, but from the very beginning, there was a lot of strong arming and kind of conniving and coercion to bring all the provinces into the union. It was if you read about it, you're not so happy about the way it took place, but it took place. There were a lot of uprisings and that sort of thing that happened out west. Those were crushed pretty mercilessly. And the way but I mean, look, Canada has always also been Christian and very British. So in the way that British did things, there was no tolerance for disorder. Mm-hmm. However, it wasn't, there wasn't this like how the communists did this just merciless destruction. It was like whatever is needed to restore order, we'll do. And then we move on all within the rule of law. So Canada is a very law-based society in that way. Within our law, we have, our country is based on the British common law system. So if something has not yet come up, we don't really have anything in place to handle it. It's kind of what's called living law, right? Like we use precedent, we use other law from England and the United States and whatnot as needed to kind of come up with the best way forward as things arise. In the 1970s, Trudeau 1 brings in a constitution, and Canadians go, good, great. We're a country now. We're not, a British Commonwealth. We can do something like the United States did, but our own version. The problem is that for every single right that's put in there, much like the UN Charter of Rights, for every right that's put in there, there's this notwithstanding clause, which means that, but if ever we decide we don't want to do that, or for whatever good reason we can't do that, tough luck. Sucks to be you.
Right.
So that's kind of the way Canada is. So it gives this room for certain authoritarianism, and that's always been held back by the culture of Canada. We're very open, we're very giving. Canadians have generally, especially at the beginning of mass immigration, tried very hard to bend over backwards to make other people feel welcome. and to make life better for people. So that's kind of kept the authoritarian possibility in check. But of course, if you give people with communistic tendencies who believe the ends justify the means, who have this grand world vision that they want to, or utopian vision that they want to bring in, of course they're going to utilize that. And so as Trudeau came in, the second Trudeau, yeah, he came in on the back of good looks and family name. It's a recognizable name. Pierre Trudeau has been lauded as this great, wonderful, almost founding father type for New Canada. Mm-hmm. And for most people, that's all they know. So they just think for Canada. There's high schools named after him. There's trophies named after him, all this sort of stuff. So young Trudeau comes in. He's good looking. People love that. He speaks well. People love that. It was kind of like, how in the United States you had these certain problems arise, and a lot of them were caused. And then you have people come up and address those problems with their solution that just so happens to be moving things even worse or in an even worse direction.
Yep.
So that's essentially it. So drugs became a big thing in Canada over, of course, the last 20 or 30 years, pushed by all sorts of stuff. So he comes in and goes, oh, yeah, we'll legalize marijuana. Sure, yeah, no one should have to go to prison. The whole nonviolent offenders and yada, 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 yada.
Right.
In addition, he really spoke to the kind of at the time, there was a big push with the new atheists and with science, right? You have the Big Bang Theories, the big show. You have all the new atheist books are the big books on the New York Times bestseller list. Everyone wants to be a scientific and progressive society because that's what that stuff pushed, right? Yeah. So he comes in and he says, okay, look, forget these conservatives, forget this old nonsense. We're going to be investing in science. We're going to invest in our young people. We're going to train you guys. We're going to get, really, we're going to be the technological giant going forward. And of course, for young people, a lot of, whom have been raised with this sort of quasi-communistic tendency, that sounded great. Hey, stop arresting people we didn't really, marijuana was already decriminalized for use. So it wasn't a big deal. But okay, it's going to be legal. Wonderful. And we're going to be super scientific and super technological. Yay, we're going to be a powerhouse, prosperity for everyone. That sounds great. And that's what was promised. And I remember at the actual election time, I probably would have voted for him too. I didn't vote that year, but I probably would have voted because the alternative was a gentleman named Stephen Harper, and he was the conservative leader. He was the incumbent prime minister. And unfortunately, all that he was able to do on the campaign trail was say Trudeau's no good, which, hey, turned out he was right. But he also said essentially like, oh, we're going to meddle with the taxes a little bit and kind of reduce them a little. And, for young people, they're like, okay, scientific greatness, a little bit less taxes, nah, or, marijuana, a little less. Anyway, so of course he won quite significantly. And he just started instituting that plan one after another. And because Canada has already been leaning so leftward, and because the Overton window is so leftward, it was just very difficult for anyone to really stand up to him. He had a really good, a little bit like Obama, a great way of speaking, a great consensus. And the media in Canada, this is another part that's really important. Mm-hmm. It's all essentially paid for and subsidized by government.
Right.
And they're leftists to begin with, right? So already, even if it was independent, they'd be leaning that way. But it's also subsidized heavily to the tune of billions of dollars a year. So essentially, it's government-funded media.
Yeah.
So there's just this kind of machine, kind of like what was in the United States with Hillary and Obama and all these guys, and then of course all the mainstream media and the Fortune 500s and BlackRock and all these guys had this kind of cabal going, where they moved things forward however they wanted to do it, and that's what's been happening in Canada.
Right.
I might have done the Putin thing, so please bring me back in. If there's anything you want to really get into.
No, that's very it's very enlightening, and it's interesting. You talk about science becoming a very scientific society. Well, much like the United States, Canada, they followed that idea over the cliff, basically. Trust the science, et cetera, when COVID erupted, and we saw, to me at least, from the eyes of an American, that was a turning point of sorts, because as bad as the lockdowns and punitive measures were down here, they seemed much worse up north there, people's bank accounts being frozen, much more severe lockdowns. It seemed really, really draconian, frighteningly so, basically. And one of the things, though, that inspired us down here, I remember, was early in 2022. Basically, the Canadian truckers, they launched and led what was known as the Freedom Convoy. Basically, a convoy of truckers and their supporters from every walk of Canadian life. Basically, heading heading east towards Ottawa, converging outside the Houses of Parliament to basically demand their rights, their freedom, and end to the lockdowns. It seemed like that was sort of a great manifestation, a great awakening to the fact how evil the overreach there in Canada was. I'll ask you to comment on that in just a bit, but first we got a clip from that period showing basically the convoy in action outside the Houses of Parliament. Let's take a look. Yeah, that display of patriotism, of this longing for freedom. That was inspiring. I remember Americans were very, very impressed with that. It's like Canada's really going. They're really doing it. That's amazing. We were still kind of trying to figure things out here, and you guys were really making a move up there. It was awesome. In fact, it inspired not just everyday Americans, but inspired Trump himself. He ended up addressing the Freedom Convoy and the plight of Canada at the CPAC conference in early 2022. We have a clip of that. Let's take a listen.
The tyranny we have witnessed in Canada in recent weeks should shock and dismay people all over the world. In an advanced Western democracy, the peaceful movement of patriotic truckers, workers, and families protesting for their most basic rights and liberties has been violently put down. Their assets and life savings have been frozen. They have been slandered as Nazis, racists, and terrorists. These are the names they've been called. They've been arrested and charged with phony crimes. They've been falsely accused of loyalty to foreign powers. I watched them. I saw those maple leafs all over the flags and the love for their country. Plenty of Americans were there too, and they love our country. They're being hunted down like enemies of their own government and treated worse than drug dealers and murderers or rapists. A line has been crossed. You're either with the peaceful truckers or you are with the left-wing fascists. And that's what's been happening. And it's been a strong line. We stand with the truckers and we stand with the Canadian people in their noble quest to reclaim their freedom. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Yes, it's good to hear him speaking like that. Would you say that was a turning point of sorts in terms of the mindset of many Canadians? Did it wake some slumbering Canadians up, that whole period?
It absolutely did. First of all, the COVID measures, the way that they went about that, like so many other places around the world, that woke up a lot of people, because it's nothing like being locked in your country, essentially locked in your home, forced to do certain things, close your business, take an injection, all this sort of stuff. That, I mean, nothing says you don't live in a free country like that. So it became very, very blatant to even the most tuned out person that the government has an immense amount of power when they want to, and can do incredible things when they want to, and you might not have a whole lot of say. So at the time, I'll just really quickly get into this. The political parties, every single one of them, including the Conservative Party, refused to condemn any of this behavior. And there's a good chance that the Conservative Party itself would have done the exact same thing had they been in power. Unlike, presumably Trump gets a lot of flack for Operation Warp Speed and some of these other things, but he didn't lock down the country. Mm-hmm. We can't necessarily say the same thing. So, I think it woke up a lot of Canadians. The trucker convoy was like in the old movies you'd have like okay, imagine the scenario. You're in a trench in World War II or World War One, and you're getting shot at. Your friends are dying. You're dwindling down. Your numbers are almost gone. You're pretty much in despair, and then you hear bagpipes on the horizon or behind you because reinforcements are coming. That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Canadians did really appreciate that, and it really did wake them up, and it woke up some sort of a patriotic spirit that hasn't yet gone away. Yeah. There's still this kind of fire because of that. But it also came at a cost to everyone who took part in it. Every single person who took part in it paid some price. I mean, for some it was their bank accounts were frozen. For others, they went to prison. For others, they had trials, like a lot like the January 6ers, right? Yes. There's trials still going on today, right, for these people. They just passed a law in Ottawa that you're not allowed to idle your car. So, like, how in cold weather you turn on your car so it warms up, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And people suspect it's because the trucks were idling in front of the Parliament building. There's no other real reason for it. So the effect it had was it definitely shocked the country enough that they decided to remove a lot of the restrictions. They still took their time to scale it back, but it did do the job. It scaled back a lot of the restrictions. And eventually it led to Trudeau resigning, right? That the consequence of that over time did eventually, it led to him having a minority government. It led to him having the only reason he's been in power the last few years is because another far left party has kind of kept him in power in Parliament, and now even that party has decided to stop. So that's why he's now resigning, because he's finally lost all the support. So really, you can trace all of that's happened up to this point back to that trucker convoy. And that really is the only reason why, I don't know how long the lockdowns would have continued, but they definitely would have continued with draconian measures. And they still have. They kept it a little more quiet, but they still have. But at least it is a step in the right direction.
Right. Yeah, very good. Well, it's good to hear that the fire that they ignited is still burning up there, because you're going to need it to begin uprooting the deep state in your own country. We down here, we're looking at just this monumental task, with a lot of people thinking only Trump could do this. You guys have to have similar resolve, because it's, really the future of your nation, your children, your grandchildren depends on all of that. So I know that we're running short on time here, so we'll wrap this up briefly here. I just want to make one more point. So I know that because of the misery that he's inflicted on the Canadian people, Trudeau and his Liberal Party, they are very, very unpopular. And as of right now, it looks like the Conservative Party of Canada, led by Pierre Poilievre, are going to be swept into power later this year when you have an election. And I just want to play a clip of Poilievre talking with a leftist reporter, because I think our American viewers will get a chuckle out of this. This is how he regards the leftist media in his own country. He doesn't necessarily come right out and slam them as fake news like Trump does, but he does as much in his own very, very restrained Canadian way. Let's take a look at this clip.
on the topic, I mean, in terms of your sort of strategy currently, you're obviously taking the populist pathway.
What does that mean?
Well, appealing to people's more emotional levels, I would guess. I mean,
What do you mean by that?
certainly
Give me an
you tap very strong ideological language quite frequently.
Like what?
Left wing, this and that, right wing. I mean, it's that type of ideological spectrum.
I never really talk about left
But
or right.
anyways,
I don't really believe in that.
Okay, a lot of people would say that you're simply taking a page out of the Donald Trump book.
Like which people would say that?
Well, I'm sure a great many Canadians, but
like who?
I don't know who, but
well, you're the one who asked the question, so
yeah.
You must know somebody.
Okay, I'm sure there's some out there, but anyways, the point of this question is, I mean, why should Canadians trust you with their vote, given not just the sort of ideological inclination in terms of taking the page out of Donald Trump's book, but
what are you
also
talking about? What page? What page? Can you give me a page? Give me the page. You keep saying
in terms of turning things quite dramatically in terms of Trudeau and the left wing and all of this. I mean, you make quite a it's quite a play that you make on it. So I'm
not
just
sure.
wondering.
I don't know what your question is.
Then forget that. Why should Canadians trust you with their vote?
Common sense.
All right, Arthur. So just if you could comment on, do you have hope that under Poilievre, if he does indeed become prime minister later this year, do you have hope that things will begin to turn around? I know it's going to be a very long process, obviously, very, very hard fight. But do you see some light at the end of a tunnel, maybe a very long tunnel?
Yeah, of course. I think when it comes to elections, I mean, we haven't had a conservative leader as good as him in a long time. I think something to keep in mind for anyone who's going into elections like this is it's absolutely not going to be perfect. You can't fix everything day one, and the person you elect is not going to be aligned on everything and is not going to fix everything. They have their own perspectives too, and their own special interests and whatever it is, right? But it's almost like if you're on shaky ground or if you're on an ice float that's going, it's breaking up, you want to find the next step to get yourself to safety. That's kind of the analogy that I would suggest. And so if you compare everything that's out there, all the options that are out there, of course, he is the best option. And there's a hope that he will help to turn things around. I mean, you don't know until they're in power, but from what he said and the way he behaves, and it looks good. It's looking good. What I would say, maybe my one suggestion, not even suggestion, my one ask, let's just say, for Canadians, but I think this applies to Americans and Brits and literally anyone who's facing the same issue, because we all are across the West. The people do have power. It sometimes doesn't feel like that, but they do. But they only have that power if they're united. So as long as you're not united, as long as you're just disparate groups of random people, then you're just voices that can be kind of ignored. The way that most people wield power in modern democracies, in the modern West, is through lobby groups, activism, these sorts of organizations, organized advocacy. And I think that one of the things that Canadians need to do right now, and Christians need to do right now, and Americans, and again, everyone, is find ways to organize like that. Mm-hmm. If there was a Christian lobby or Christian union in Canada, those church burnings wouldn't be happening or wouldn't be going unaddressed. Right. If there was a Canadian Citizens Organization, a lot of what's been happening right now would not be happening, because in the end, there is still power in with the people. Yeah. So those would be my biggest suggestions. Get organized. It really, everyone else is, and if you're not, you're losing out.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, very wise words, very astute observations, Arthur. I agree wholeheartedly. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. We could talk for hours about this subject, about the future of Canada and the United States and all the West. And I'm sure we'll be doing so in the future. There's there's a lot to come, I think, for both of our countries, and may God bless them both. So thank you very much, Arthur, for joining us today. And to our viewers, thank you for tuning in. If you like what we do here at Souls on Liberty, please click on the provided donate link to help keep us going. We appreciate your support very much. Until next time, I'm Stephen Wynn, joining you from Kansas City. God bless.